This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Well, I was saying that there are, of course, many different kinds of islands, and that our job as historians is obviously to differentiate, to historicize, to go into all the little aspects that really go against the sameness of islands as a whole. But I was going to introduce the talk with reference to two paintings by Agnes Martin that I recently saw at the Tate Modern Retrospective. The first, from around 1961, is a single canvas painted with delicacy and deep settled emotion. The islands of the title are little white spots, all quite similar, forced into a barely visible grid that characterizes much of Martin's work. In their uniformity, they remind me of the stylized islands of many late medieval and early modern charts. A second piece by the artist, titled Islands 1 to 12, was also on show at the Tate. I was certainly not the only one to experience a sort of epiphany there, standing almost alone in a large white room surrounded by these 12 paintings from 1979. No photographs can render the subtle beauty of the paintings, delicately crafted in tones of white and grey, each different, but each capturing the same nebulous melancholy, the same isolation, the same lonesomeness that may, after all, constitute the deeper essence of all islands as humans think about them. It makes sense, doesn't it, that Judith Shalansky, in her best-selling book, Atlas of Remote Islands, 50 Islands I Have Not Visited and Never Will, should have chosen as her first unvisited island one that is called Island of Solitude. Ensomheden in Norwegian, I don't speak Norwegian, but just simulate. Einsamkeit in German, Ujedinja in Russian, the latter referring to withdrawal, retreat, distance from the world. What I'm trying to say is this, that we as historians, as astute and, as I said, annoyingly picky analysts of realities, past and present, may well feel an urge to say no island is like any other, they're all different, and they keep changing all the time. Yes, but there may also be something deeper, almost ahistorical, about the way societies think about them from the inside and from the outside. Now, Naoko didn't invite me so I could indulge in poetic fantasies, but to say I've just done that, but to say a few words about Sri Lanka, an island that I have studied mostly for the 16th and 17th centuries, with regard to its contacts with the Portuguese. Now, Sri Lanka as an island is a central programmatic notion of Sinhala Buddhist nationalism today, that the island exists naturally as such a coherent abode, is self-evident to those thinking in such terms. This is very important. And we as historians are, of course, well advised to be wary about anything that nature is supposed to have given us. So, if we are to question the myths that underlie such constructs as the nation, which is part of our jobs, then we also have to question the myth of islands. So far, so good. But consider this irony. Precisely we as historians are then also confronted with the historical fact, that people in the past have thought about their islands precisely in those terms that we wish to deconstruct. There's a paradox here, of course. We do our job, that's our duty, we deconstruct, we look into discontinuities, differences, etc., etc. But as we look into the distant past, we see people in that distant past also inventing and theorizing their islands in ways that we are critical of today. Now this brings us to Sujit Sivasundaram's brilliant book, Islanded, Britain, Sri Lanka and the Bounds of an Indian Ocean Colony. I'm sorry that Sujit couldn't be here today. Although I'm going to be both enthusiastic and critical of what he has written. In a nutshell, Sivasundaram argues that the British invested heavily in detaching Ceylon from India and making it into a coherent, separate island colony during the first half of the 19th century. Now, the author doesn't say that the British islanded Sri Lanka completely from scratch. He's smart enough to admit and to insist to a certain extent that indigenous notions did play a role and survived within the transformations propelled by the global empire that absorbed Sri Lanka. So he's not saying that all this invention happened out of nothing, that the British just came and made up the island. The author admits, for example, that the kings of Kandy, I do have a map of Sri Lanka, the mountain kingdom of the interior of the island, which was conquered by the British in 1815-ish, had themselves claimed overlordship over the island as a whole well before. So there was an island imaginary in place and politically operative before. Rather than pitching the British fully against their Kandyan predecessors, Sivasundram speaks of recycling and movement as being at the heart of the establishment of colonial rule. The British took ideas from the Kandyan past only to, I'm quoting, repackage and redefine them. To make Ceylon into a separable colony, the British set in motion discourses about it, I quote, as a romanticized and sexualized island, a lost Eden, which was very different from the barren and Hindu mainland, that is, the south of India. They pitched the Sinhala majority against the Tamil minority. They restricted movement across the sea between India and Ceylon. They built new roads to make the territory more coherent internally. They drew new maps and even planned to dredge a navigable channel between the island and India. Now, all this islanding, all this invention makes for great reading, and it really is a wonderful book. It's thematically ordered, it works really fine. But there is also a much deeper history of islanding in the background, I think, to which the author has not paid quite as much attention as I think he might have. In large measure because as a historian of the modern British Empire and of modern science and technology, his categories just don't sit very well with the pre-modern world. And here I blame not only modernists for not taking our pre-modern scholarship seriously enough, that's of course something, but I also blame myself and ourselves for not producing the scholarship that can cut across this divide and that might fully and truly engage modernists, in this case working on Sri Lanka. I'm not saying that everyone has to keep going back to Adam and Eve to write their history. Heligoland in the Renaissance would probably be a little bit of a stretch as a topic. So you're dispensed from that. But there are things we do need to take into account, such as the fact that for many centuries before 1800, before the British arrived even, people in and around Sri Lanka had been involved in various forms or manners of islanding. The point is that each epoch has its own ways of doing it, of attaching meaning to what we might call the island fact. I'm here not just thinking of such open and cosmopolitan notions as the island as a hub. I was just telling Naoko there's a conference this week in Germany about the art of hubbing, essentially a project on maritime connectivity from the perspective of Port Louis on Mauritius, which I'm not sure how explicitly it refers back to older notions such as le carrefour javanais. I don't know if anyone is familiar with this, that it's a whole theory by Denis Lombard about Java as a pre-modern crossroads of trade, but also of cultures. I am thinking, alas, about much more parochial but deeply influential trends of conceptualizing the island or islands as places distinct from the outside world. This stands in a field of tension between the way historians like Sheldon Pollock and Ronit Ritchie have thought about ample cosmopolitan formations in Asia, that's the Sanskrit cosmopolis, the Arabic cosmopolis, these very attractive to historians and to the general public ample formations that unite Asia, the Asian space, different Asian cultures. On the one hand, we have that, but on the other hand, we have things like the process of localization that O.W. Walters has worked on for Southeast Asia. Localization is the integration of foreign cultural elements into local culture by detaching them from the foreign, making them your own, without reference to the foreign. For example, the in principle universalistic Indian notion of Chakravarti emperorship, that is universal empire, universal rule, was taken by Sri Lankans and theorized in medieval Sri Lanka as coinciding with Lanka as an island rather than the world as a whole. That seems to be a moment of localization. Supreme kingship in Sri Lanka was associated with overlordship over the various areas of this relatively small, well, larger than the other islands that we'll hear about in a minute. The idealization itself of the island as a beautiful lady goes way back. We have a first poetic expression of this idea in the 10th century. Much before that, the island is idealized as the abode of Buddhism, where the Buddha has, with his presence, blessed the country and created the perfect place for Buddhism to thrive. So these idealizations go very far back in the past. In my own studies of the 16th century, what I have come to encounter is how these various layers of knowledge about the island as a special place were transfused into Portuguese imperial discourses. The Portuguese were not particularly interested in Sri Lanka, but the Sri Lankan elites kept telling them these stories, these topoi about how special Sri Lanka was as an island, not as an open, cosmopolitan, connected hub, but as an island coherent and closed upon itself. The Portuguese then set out to conquer it, and in doing that, they added their own twist to the story. They conceptualized Sri Lanka as a realm of sovereign territorial rule, which was something that Europe was inventing at the time in the late 1500s. They took it and projected it onto Sri Lanka at that moment. So what I wish to say in sum is that islands may appear to be modern inventions at a certain level, yes, but they have been there to be thought about and to be idealized and to be made open or closed for a very long time. In this sense, then, we may wish to think about islands in Asian history neither just as wonderfully open crossroads, nor just as places suddenly perverted into theaters of nation building, colonial, post-colonial. We may also want to embrace the concept of islanding, for which I'm very, very grateful to Sijit, as something that has gone on for a very long time, much longer than modernists tend to think, in many different places and in very different ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Zoltan. Yep.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I've spent the last couple of years trying to think hard about islands, and it's nice to actually have a forum to share some of those broader ideas. My paper is going to be a bit more global and imperial historical, so I try to draw some wider parallels between different regions, including Southeast Asia. So, my main argument today is that islands were often the primary node in regional and global interpolity networks in the 19th century. They were more than just points on the travel routes of long-distance trading. They were examples of a particular kind of politically plural land-sea formation. For centuries, empires had assembled uneven control over irregular and connected territories in maritime spaces, some extending along coastal and sea corridors, and others encompassing parts of islands linked to straits, and some conjoining patches of sea and land around ports. The imagination of land-sea connections reflected a strategic reality. Prospects for the survival of colonial venture depended heavily on the placement of settlements within maritime circuits and on conditions of competition on the ocean. Where many polities were trading from the same small region, merchants and the sponsors vied for access to the sea. These types of politically polyglot spaces in turn fostered a politically polyglot people. The history of European empires at the turn of the 19th century is in no small part a story of maritime competition. Rivalries centered on islands, coastal zones, and sea routes that formed the connective tissue of transoceanic trade and movement. Islands in the world of colonial expansion thus functioned as zones of imperial rivalry, but they also functioned as zones of interaction and mingling, especially at the level of everyday practice. As imperial control of borders and territories tightened during the 19th century, this interaction came under pressure, but island regions in particular often displayed an exceptionally porous sovereignty. Even the British Empire's attempts at controlling its maritime borders often failed, as a growing wave of small crafts carried goods and peoples into and out of imperial islands and ports. This was particularly prevalent in the decades after the 1807 abolition of the slave trade, during which time British administrators in the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean in particular were faced with the almost insurmountable task of blocking the illegal shipping of slaves. In Mauritius, for example, light patrols to intercept slave traders after the Abolition Act encountered a busy trade in small boats, and officials recorded a sharp growth in the slave population of Mauritius and the Seychelles. Small craft landed slaves at night along beaches where they were met by locals and distributed to markets. Sir Robert Farquhar, the governor at the time, requested additional forces to curb the trade, and commissioners described, quote, a general disposition in the inhabitants in favor of the slave trade. Here and elsewhere, the British Abolition Act actually produced a short-term windfall for traders in coastal and island regions. The majority of my research so far has focused on islands and maritime networks in the Atlantic world, primarily in the Leeward Islands in the Caribbean. This chain of islands stretches from the Virgin Islands in the northwest to Dominica in the southeast. British, Danish, Dutch, French, Spanish, and even Swedish empires claimed islands in this group, and the small islands lay within such a short distance from one another that a ship could easily sail from one end to the other in a matter of a few days. In some island clusters, such as the Virgin Islands in the western part, the distances were even shorter, and slaves or fugitives could sometimes escape by swimming or even drifting to neighboring islands. Port cities like Charlotte Amalie on St. Thomas and Oranjestad on St. Eustatius came to be favored by traders of multiple nationalities, and the goods that were transshipped here were transported under a growing number of national and imperial flags. The result was a tightly networked, politically plural colonial region in which British power on the seas made possible British sojourning across islands, including those nominally in the hands of other empires. As in Mauritius, growing British naval power created greater incentives for traders to use small crafts and avoid detection, though many were nonetheless apprehended. An inquiry into the fate of prize slaves in British Tortola in the early 1820s recorded dozens of captures of small craft and found evidence of a robust contraband trade in slaves and other goods passing between the British ports and other islands. Security in the Leeward Islands functioned on an intercolonial level as well. Fear of rebellions led to intercolonial networks taking on the task of providing mutual security despite the perpetual imperial rivalries of the period. The large amount of enslaved laborers used in agricultural production instilled no small amount of fear in the white planters, who faced a series of slave uprisings and numerous reported alleged conspiracies. Fears of colonial instability led to a peculiar situation of improvised independence for the metropole in matters of security and organized violence. Rather than being turned towards external threats like inter-imperial warfare, the scarce and often undermanned military resources present on these islands were instead focused on internal threats, namely slave rebellion. When faced with a threat too serious for local garrisons or militias to handle, which happened often, governors and magistrates would often turn to the neighboring colonies for help, even when those colonies did not belong to the same empire. A different set of networks facilitated the widespread and long-lived inter-imperial contraband trade. Regional smuggling became a force of integration in its own right, creating enduring networks between different groups of people across formal borders and tying colonial, imperial, and extra-imperial actors in relationships of generally mutual benefit. These regional networks were not static and strictly spatially bounded phenomena, but were rather dynamic structures that external and mobile actors could manipulate, provided they were familiar with the geography and the specific practices. Now moving to the Asian part of my paper. My current area of research is island regions of colonial Southeast Asia and the South China Sea in the middle decades of the 19th century. I think there are clear parallels between the intercolonial configurations of the Caribbean and those in Southeast Asia. I'm particularly interested in the connections existing between the British colonies in Singapore and Hong Kong, Dutch Indonesia, Spanish Manila, and the pre-existing trading networks operating in the region. For the sake of the 10-minute limit, I'm going to talk about Singapore. An English sailor who arrived in Singapore in February of 1833 described a port in which ships from all parts of the world were constantly arriving, where, quote, the flags of Great Britain, Holland, France, and America may often be seen intermingled with the streamers of the Chinese junks and the fanciful color of local boats. and where Chinese, Malays, Bugis, Javanese, Balinese, natives of Bengal and Madras, Parsis, Arabs, and Kaffirs are all to be found. The city's initial founding was part of a British attempt to break the Dutch colonial monopoly on Southeast Asian trade, as the Dutch East India Company held significant ports on Malaya, Sumatra, Java, and Celebes. While inter-imperial competition between Dutch and British companies continued throughout much of the 1820s, it soon subsided and was in part replaced by increased cross-colonial trade, much of it centering on Singapore. The port city became particularly favored as a center of transshipment, located as it was between the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, and the Gulf of Siam. While European merchants carried out much of this trade, non-European regional traders were also heavily involved. A multitude of sailors had utilized the Strait of Malacca to travel from South Asia to the Chinese coast for centuries before colonial contact, and the Silk Road of the Sea provided a pre-existing network structure that European, Chinese, and Southeast Asian entrepreneurial traders could all plug into. Singapore was at once a global and a regional space. While it was nominally part of a globe-spanning European empire, the majority of its population, almost all of which consisted of migrants, was Chinese. While it saw an increasing number of ships passing through its harbor on their way to far-off ports in other regions, including the Americas, Europe, and even the Middle East, a majority of its trade remained intra-regional. Even this regional trade was global in scope, however, as many of the merchants arriving from Java and Malaya originally hailed from Europe or the Middle East, and many traders based in Singapore itself came from the northeastern regions of China. In this sense, as was the case in many other island regions, Singapore witnessed an increasing level of globalization filtered into and through a multi-layered regional context, networks operating within networks, and regional integration spurring on global flows and interactions. The global significance of island regions in part reflected the sheer density of interpolity networks operating in these types of spaces. Such networks formed both across European colonies and between colonies and local polities, integrating a plurality of actors into regionally embedded structures of exchange and interaction. Intercolonial trade, especially the transport and sale of contraband goods, defined regional commercial ties, and shared perceptions of security often motivated political coordination and cross-colonial engagement. The view of islands presented here strikes against the standard notion of a shift away from a maritime imagination of empire towards a territorial focus during the long 19th century. As the forces shaping regionalism and global integration in the early 19th century unfolded along politically patchwork and polyglot coasts and archipelagos, they produced complex geography that tended to fall outside our models of borderland regions. Tracing networks of political, economic, and legal connections across polities highlights the role of islands and ports as sites for the articulation of maritime and territorial politics. The emerging narratives of world and global history would do well to preserve a spot for the coastal and island regions of the 19th century, when areas previously regarded as imperial backwaters surged to positions of global importance and generated new patterns of cross-policy cooperation and conflict. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Paul Kreitman.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone, and thank you Nalgo for organising this and inviting me. So, what I'm going to try and do today is sort of rattle through my dissertation, one of the main arguments very quickly. And Nalgo's going to cut me off brutally if I go on too long, but hopefully this will be within the 12 minutes. So my dissertation looks at a series of tiny islands in the North Pacific, almost all of which are now uninhabited. There we go, yeah. And as you probably know, the Senkaku or the Diaoyu Islands on the left are to this day the subject of a fiercely contested dispute between Japan and both governments of China over who actually has a sovereign control over them. I realise I should have put Diaoyu on there as well. It's not me picking a side. What I'm not going to do today is tell you who the islands belong to. That's what I guess that's a reflection of the fact that today I'm going to be telling a story mainly from the Japanese perspective, but obviously there are other names for those islands, as you all know. So my argument is that historically there are three ways in which states have looked at these kind of uninhabited islands, these mujinto or wurenda, and those are as essentially non-sovereign places, as places that can be claimed as sovereign through colonization or settlement, and finally as wilderness places that states ought to conserve from human impact by preventing settlement or unauthorized access. And a good example would be John Manjiro, who was one of the many fishermen who were shipwrecked on Torishima, this middle island, during the kind of Edo period. Torishima just means bird island, by the way. It's a pretty simple name. And the reason it's called that is because the fishermen survived by eating the many birds that lived there while they waited to be rescued. And John Mangelo actually eventually got picked up by an American whaler and had all these adventures, and it was kind of turned into a kind of Robinson Crusoe type patriotic adventurer hero. And he was a remarkable guy. But my point here is to sort of say that at the time, neither John Mangelo or any of the other fishermen who got stuck on Torishima or when they ever thought to claim it as a Japanese sovereign territory. There was nothing there for them to claim, but also they didn't have the way of thinking about territory and about colonization that would later come along. Now this changed from the mid-19th century or so, when states began to look at these islands in a new way, for a number of reasons. They became valuable as sites of commodity production, generally because of their bird populations in various ways. So the bird's feathers could be used to make women's hats that were in great demand by kind of fashionistas in Paris, London, and New York at this time. And their shit could be shoveled to be used as guano fertilizer to grow all kinds of crops. This is a photo of some Japanese guano miners shoveling bird shit, essentially calcified bird shit, on an island that's now part of Hawaii in Laysan Island. And this made islands like Torishima attractive to all kinds of entrepreneurial figures who set about trying to exploit them through various schemes. And these entrepreneurs frequently, not always, but quite often, enlisted the state on their behalf to try and assert their property rights over these islands, claiming to have discovered them or have settled them. This is a rather elaborate development scheme for Torishima proposed by a man called Tamaoki Hayamon as part of his successful application for the Japanese government to annex the island in 1887. It's a bit bright, sorry. Now, obviously, colonial projects of one country or another have a very long history indeed, going back, as Zoltan pointed out, long before the Portuguese. But what I think is new in the 19th century, and I'm tapping into Lauren Benton to a large degree here, is that around the globe you see the export of a particular kind of quasi-Lockean conception of transferable and yet inalienable property rights, over land. And this creates a new understanding of political authority in which state sovereignty is exercised directly over territory rather than simply over people. And the fact that these kind of sovereignty claims become possible during this period is just as important as the fact of these islands having these newfound resource value because of their birds and so on. So it's also that there are ways for private actors like Tamaoki to enlist states' aid to claim these islands. Now, as you might expect, this gives rise to all kinds of diplomatic complications if you have these kind of adventurer opportunists kind of rattling around the oceans, just claiming islands speculatively. Then you're going to get kind of clashes, some of which became quite heated. So as kind of different people assert conflicting claims over the same island. So one of these that kind of came to a head in 1902 was the Marcus Island incident, where basically an American guano mining expedition faced off against the Japanese Navy over who would control this particular island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. I mean, really in the middle of the North Pacific, a long way from anywhere. I can talk about this more in the Q&A if necessary, but I'll move on because of time. But anyway, this is a new way in which states are looking at or being convinced to look at these kinds of islands. As territory came to be claimed, colonized, territory that could be claimed, colonized, and exploited. And of course, there are all kinds of quasi-strategic rationales that get sort of bandied about at the same time as kind of landing stations for telegraph cables, as airstrips, weather stations, coaling stations. But at least initially, I think, really these kind of strategic considerations took a backseat to the commercial imperatives, which is really driving what's going on here. But the thing about, it's more about Marcus Island. Anyway, the thing about these commercial schemes is while they may have succeeded in the short or medium term, and indeed made men like Tamaoki a lot of money, he became a very wealthy man, did not translate into permanent settlements on most of these islands. Bird populations declines, in many cases were just wiped out completely, and global fashion trends changed. So basically on the eve of the First World War, feathers are no longer cool, and the commodity price of export feathers just plummets. Skip that one. And after this, you get kind of these quite vigorous efforts, actually quite spirited efforts, to turn Torishima into a cattle ranch, which never really takes off. Not just because the island's quite remote, because it keeps exploding. So once in 1902, and again in 1939, and that really sort of kills off any chance of really settling this place permanently. And then what happens in the post-war period is that you see the rise of a new third way of looking at these islands, which is as sites of rare wildlife that the state has an obligation to protect. So the albatross, which gets enshrined as a natural monument of the nation, a tennenki nembutsu. And now the Japanese state takes on the task of ensuring that Torishima remains uninhabited, rather than trying to settle it as it did in the past. My point here is not just that the opportunity cost of this kind of commitment is actually quite low, because no one wants to live there really, but also that this constitutes a new, let's call it a non-colonial technique of asserting sovereignty over islands. And the irony of this becomes particularly acute in the case of the Senkaku Islands. To go over their history very quickly, they first get visited by Japanese in any kind of large scale in the 1880s, and they're after the mother of pearl for export and the albatross feathers. And later, one of them becomes the site of a fish cannery. But that goes out of business in about 1940, and after that, the islands no longer have any Japanese living on them. And then this happens. In the 1960s and 70s, it's discovered by the Japanese media, by the newspapers, that the Senkaku Islands are being visited quite frequently by these fishermen from Taiwan, who are in the habit of collecting seabird eggs. And the Japanese press gets quite worked up about this, with these kind of editorials calling for something to be done to protect the Senkaku seabirds from this inexcusable overhunting by these Chinese who are illegally trespassing on Japanese sovereign territory, of course. There's not actually much they can do in this because of the complicated international politics of Senkaku at that moment. It's a particular instance, kind of the 1960s and 70s, which we can talk about later, maybe. So what the only kind of official act you get is these kind of literally token expressions of sovereignty, these stamps, which is sort of a declaring that this is inherently sort of Ryukyuan or Japanese wildlife, and their presence on these islands shows that these islands are inherently part of the Japanese national geobody, to sort of quote Minichiko there. So if earlier Japanese sovereignty was based on the production of commodities, material commodities such as feathers and guano, now it's based on these kind of commodified images of wildlife and biodiversity like this. And this process continues. To give you a recent example from the news, in 2013, the mayor of Ishigaki Island, which is the Japanese settlement closest to the Senkaku, gave an interview with the Sankei Shimbun newspaper. It's quite a conservative leading newspaper in Japan. And in this interview, he cited a recent publication by Japanese geneticists, which asserted that the albatrosses nesting on the Senkakus constituted their own subspecies and should be managed, therefore, as a distinct conservation unit. And the mayor claimed that these albatrosses were in danger from various feral goats and cats and so on, and explained that he had submitted an application to the government in Tokyo asking it to revise its current bid for UNESCO heritage status for the Ryukyu Islands, so that they would incorporate the Senkaku group as well. Now, this announcement soon triggered a fiery response from the Chinese mainland media. So this is a screen grab from a CCTV news bulletin in September 2013, attacking what they see as a Japanese plot to so they use the pretext of environmental protection to snatch the islands from us. Now, it's tempting to dismiss this kind of stuff as just state-directed propaganda, but setting aside the question of who the islands really belong to, who is snatching from who, and who rightfully owns them, I do think it contains a kernel of truth. That there is a kind of relationship between nature conservation and state assertion of territorial sovereignty. And the mayor of Ishigaki was clearly hoping that should UNESCO recognize the Senkaku group as part of the UNESCO heritage site, this recognition could then be used to bolster Japan's claim for sovereignty over the islands. Do I have one more slide? Okay, last slide. Just to take it outside Japan or East Asia and look at it in a global context, this is a WikiLeaks cable. We have a British diplomat discussing the Chagos Islands, site of the notorious US military base, where terrorist suspects get subject to kind of extraordinary rendition, all these kinds of things. And the residents of these islands were evacuated in the 1970s to make way for this military base, and they're suing the British government to be allowed to return. So the Foreign Commonwealth has this kind of ingenious solution that they can just establish a nature reserve, and they're quite candid about why they're doing this. And they say, here at the bottom, if the British Indian Ocean Territory's former inhabitants, these inhabitants would find it difficult, if not impossible, to pursue their claim for resettlement on the islands if the entire archipelago were a marine reserve. And this is what happened. There is a marine reserve now in the Chagos Islands, and this is why they're doing it, to keep people from settling there, and therefore maintain this kind of sovereign grip on these islands. I'll stop there and turn on to who's next. Is it Jan? Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. History, Fernand Braudel once wrote, likes to make use of islands. He meant this in a socio-economic and geographical sense. Islands had functioned throughout history as outposts and stepping stones for trade and migration. But the same is true in metaphorical terms. And this metaphorical use of islands is, of course, what John Gillis is after in his book Islands of the Mind, which some of you will know. Rather than investigate the socio-economic function of islands in the past, Gillis investigates the culture of islands. He's asking less what happened on islands in the past and more what the historical imagination did with islands. So my approach with regard to a very small place in the North Sea has been to take both worlds seriously, to link the remote geographical reality in which people lived and died with its metaphorical uses, in this case in the two countries which laid claim to this spot in the 19th and 20th centuries. But let me introduce this place first. This is a map that I think is very similar to the one you used, and if we go one further in, you begin to see Heligoland there in between the British Isles and the North German coast, and I think this is, well, sort of zooming in. Out there in the North Sea, about 4.5 hours northwest of Hamburg and 300 miles off the east coast of England, sits Heligoland. In good weather, you can see the imposing cliffs from more than a dozen of miles, rising abruptly to 80 feet above the crashing waves, a steep triangular bastion of an island. Half a mile to its east lies Sandy Island, a flat sand dune that looks like a geological accident threatening to be washed away by the North Sea. In between these unlikely twins ebbs and flows a comparably calm stretch of water, sheltered from the northwesterly by the cliffs. Sailors have relied on this natural harbour ever since humans began to cross the sea between the north of Europe and the British Isles. For generations, Britain and Germany have collided in this miniature archipelago. The two nations' pasts are etched into the rust-coloured, blotched sandstone cliffs. Wherever you turn, Heligoland's scarred landscape reveals the imprint of war, the craters and broken rock formations, the iron and concrete remnants of Germany's Gibraltar, built and demolished with equal determination, the grown-over ruins of the dream of sea power bombed again and again. In 1947, British forces detonated here the largest non-nuclear explosion on record, blowing up what was left of Hitler's North Sea fortress. A long history of Anglo-German conflict came thus to a symbolic end. But long before it became Germany's North Sea bulwark and was fought over in 2 world wars, this was Britain's smallest colony, an inconvenient and notoriously discontented border island. Its location at the fringes of Europe, where the British Empire ended and the German-speaking world began, intrigued geographers and colonial officials alike. Sir Charles Lucas, the head of the department responsible at the Colonial Office, described Heligoland as, quote, the point at which Great Britain and Germany come most nearly into contact with each other, and the only part of the world in which the British government rules an exclusively Teuton, though not English-speaking, population. Contact, however, was an understatement. A web of laws and customs made it impossible to establish a boundary here between the British Empire and the different Germanies that existed in the long 19th century. For the Germans flocking to the island ever since it opened its bathing establishment in 1826, Heligoland was a satellite to their continent, just outside the fatherland but very much part of it. It was here in a British colony off the German coast that the political refugee August Heinrich Hoffmann von Fallersleben composed the Lied der Deutschen, later to become Germany's national anthem. From early on, this was then an island of the mind as much as an island of conquest. Poets and painters from Heinrich Heine in the 1830s to Anselm Kiefer in the 1980s styled the cliff-bound outpost as a monument of German identity. However different these constructs of nationhood were, they focused in common on two aspects: Germany's boundaries and its relationship with the sea, the latter almost inevitably involving the British. German sentiment about Heligoland was thus always in part a sentiment about Britain, its naval power, its attitude towards Europe, and its role in the world. For the British, Heligoland provided a lens through which to interpret Germany. The island was a parable for the Anglo-German relationship, as Austin Harrison, the editor of the English Review, wrote in 1907. The meanings of this metaphor changed dramatically in the course of the 2 centuries. When the Salisbury government ceded the colony to the Kaiser, it was proclaimed as a token of friendship, heralding a new era of Anglo-German collaboration. Only from the turn of the century did Heligoland change in the British imagination. The forlorn colonial outpost, that gem of the North Sea, became a dark rock symbolizing the German menace. H.G. Wells, Erskine Childers, and a host of lesser writers used the outpost as a metaphor for what had gone wrong with the Germans. Giving the island to the Kaiser had been a momentous mistake, argued Winston Churchill and Admiral John Fisher. Their mantra, "No more Heligolands," meant no more concessions, no more appeasement. Situated at the fault line between imperial and national histories, this barren rock in the North Sea provides an apt location from where to rethink the Anglo-German past. That, however, I won't bore you with, and that might not be at the heart of your interest, and might not be terribly useful for this seminar either. The main argument about that relationship that for me is connected to this island is one of the longer time frame in which we ought to understand that relationship, a longer story that, in my case, begins in the Napoleonic Wars and ends in the Cold War. Following the arc of the Anglo-German relationship as it spans roughly the past 2 centuries, allows us to appreciate the many ways in which Europe and the British Empire were bound up with one another. We're used to thinking of the two as opposite poles. Historians and politicians have fostered a narrative in which the empire allowed Britain to disengage from Europe, as if the two were clear-cut opposites, with Britain in a position to choose one over the other. This is very much a 20th century idea, reflecting more than anything Britain's changed global position after the Second World War. The imperial project, insofar as there was one, was never isolated from Europe, nor did it allow Britons to isolate themselves from Europe. The UK's trade was rarely exclusively with either Europe or the rest of the world, it was with both. The same was true in strategic terms. Colonial expansion hinged on European stability, while overseas conflict typically went hand in hand with European instability. Just as the Empire and Europe were not two separate spheres between which Britain could choose, national and imperial impulses were not neatly separated out in the rise of Germany. The unification and expansion of the Bismarckian nation-state took place in a global context for which the British Empire played a key role. At the very time when borders became invested with unprecedented national symbolism, the wealth of nations depended more and more on their ability to overcome boundaries economically and culturally. The case of Heligoland is typical of this paradox. It offers a microhistory of both the transnational relationships that bound 19th century Germany and the British Empire together, and the reverse process, in which the world of Anglo-German collaboration was challenged by the nationalizing process that accelerated towards the end of the 19th century. After 1890, when Imperial Germany acquired this small island for colonial concessions in Africa mostly, nation and empire were to be symbolically disentangled in the very period when Britain and Germany were becoming more interdependent than ever before. Making a small island in the North Sea the main character of a history of Britain and Germany clearly follows a tradition of scholars who have discovered large contexts in small settings. In many ways, this is very much a local history, but local should not be taken to mean isolation from larger explanations. For microhistories to work, they have to engage simultaneously with small settings and large contexts. So in order to achieve that, I've tried to crisscross between local, regional, national and imperial archives. I don't neglect the perspective from the political cockpits, if you like, and some of the papers have exactly taken a very similar approach. But I try to refract this view from London and Berlin through the everyday life of the Heligolanders themselves, and even more so the life of those involved with them, amongst them spies, traders, smugglers and soldiers. So their voices interrupt the flow of dispatches and memoranda that most of you will be so familiar with, and that dispatches and memoranda that swell the endless files left behind by the colonial and foreign officers. And then there are the many artifacts which really made this an island of the mind: paintings, poetry, literature, music, maps, charts, travel logs, caricatures, photographs, newspapers, films. The island provides, in the end, really, you could almost say, only the name of a place under which these different sources are then tied together. Thank you.